can you tell us what are unused cloud identities? What falls under that umbrella?
So there are lots of different types of identities that can be left behind that are no longer being used. Machine identities like enterprise app credentials or role credentials. You could have people identities like users, IAM users, or Azure AD users that no longer need their access. They don't log in anymore. Some of those may have keys associated with them that would allow programmatic access. And of course, keys can be left behind places. So those identities, they oftentimes get left behind and never get cleaned up. And one of the reasons people don't pay as much attention to the identities as they do things like orphaned infrastructure are that there's no inherent cost to an identity in the cloud. So you don't get charged for every user, you don't get charged for every machine identity. And therefore, it's a much bigger problem of just how pervasive these unused identities are in the cloud.
Great. And you shared a little bit about this, but can you detail more how these identities come about?
Yeah, so there's lots of different ways. So you might, for a person identity, you may have a person who leaves the company, for instance. You went to another company, you may have credentials that are left behind. You may still have access to cloud environment, to resources, to even sensitive assets in the cloud that never get cleaned up. The things that kind of fall outside of that realm that are more interesting are machine identities. If I'm a developer and I'm building an application in the cloud, I may need to build out some different identities for testing. I may need to build out identities that have access to data that my application needs to access. I may never actually move that application to production. But those identities, even if they're no longer being used, are oftentimes left behind. Maybe I clean up the infrastructure when I'm done because it costs money, but I don't actually clean up the identity, and that leaves an opening. And it's very difficult when you look in the actual cloud provider portal to see that you have unused identities. And when you look at a list of IAM users or roles, you don't necessarily see their last use date, where if the credentials for that identity were to be left behind somewhere on a workload or in a bucket or just a GitHub repo, that identity could still be used to access your cloud, even if the infrastructure that you originally used it to access is no longer there.
You totally jumped the gun there, and I just started to answer exactly what my next question was going to be, which is just like, what is the harm of these unused identities? I mean, they're just sitting in the cloud. They're not causing any issues, or are
Yeah.
they increasing risk in some way?
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of think of it as just an opening into your cloud environment. So, as an example, I might have a role that's no longer being used. Maybe I provisioned it to allow some third-party access into my cloud for a vendor or for an assessment I was doing. And then I never cleaned up that role. Years later, even, an attacker could then gain access into your cloud environment. And the permissions on that role may be highly sensitive. And even, you have the ability not just to get into the cloud via orphaned identities, but also to move laterally. No matter how I get into your cloud environment, maybe I come in through a vulnerable workload. I could still then, from a workload, pivot over to the identities that workload can access. Maybe I have an unused identity that allows me then to move to a different account. So it can, allow attackers into your cloud, but it can also, once they're in, allow them to move laterally and gain access to things that you really don't want them to have access.